400 years ago, the world experienced a revolution as far-reaching and as shattering as any other revolution in history, even though it was bloodless. It was a revolution in communication technology with the rise of movable type and the printing press. And it would spark enormous social changes, of which the very first was the Protestant Reformation. So, in other words, communications can have vast consequences for people's lives. Today, we're going to be talking about mass culture and mass communications with one of the country's leading experts on the subject. Garth Jowett is well known to most people in Houston. We're familiar with him, of course, from his many appearances on KTRH and on local television stations, where he has played a very important role as a media commentator, an election analyst, and above all, a person who can put contemporary changes in communications technologies into readily understandable terms. Professor Jowett is the author of many books, of which one has had particular influence, the most important history of the film industry that exists, a book called Film, the Democratic Art, which has been widely reprinted. But that's not his only area of expertise. While he's one of the country's leading authorities on the history of film, he has also done extensive work on issues of propaganda, of issues of using media to influence opinion. And so among his other books is one called Propaganda and Persuasion, and most recently, a book on an extremely controversial subject in America today, children and the movies. In a bit, we'll have a chance to ask Professor Jowett many questions about the state and fate of communications technology today. But what he's going to do first is take us back to understand the rise of mass society and mass communications, and then carry this story forward and put our contemporary concerns in historical perspective. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Steve. I appreciate it. I should hire you as my personal publicity assistant, which, of course, everybody has these days in the form of a homepage, but we'll get to that later. If you don't have a homepage soon, you don't have the right to exist. That famous Descartesian statement, I think, therefore I am, is going to be, I have a homepage, therefore I am. So we'll move away from that. The history of communications is a fascinating subject, as much for having been ignored for so many years as for the fact that it is now being seriously studied. When I started as a graduate student in the late 1960s, I was lucky enough to be at an institution, the University of Pennsylvania, where the history department took very seriously the fact that communications had an important role to play in the development of our modern society. The reason I say that is because as late as the mid-1980s, I was having to defend the right of a graduate student at a very prestigious institution, which I will not name, who wanted to do a dissertation involving film. He wanted to examine a very important aspect of the history of film as it related to politics. And this very prestigious institution that he was at did not feel that the study of film was an appropriate topic for a history PhD student. Now, I mention this because it has taken a significantly long time for historians particularly to recognize the role that communication has played, what we loosely call the mass media, but other forms of communication, such as the telegraph, the telephone, and so forth, that those instruments of information transmission and information transferring have been very, very significant in shaping our society, from everything in terms of architecture down to the smallest notion of how do people celebrate birthdays, how do they transfer money, and so forth. Only in the last 10 to 15 years have historians begun to pay serious attention to trying to understand how these various technologies of communication have interacted and have been responsible to a very large extent for what modern society today is. I think to start at the end, we are now in the midst of a major transformation in society where the true information society, as it was called back 15 years ago, has now begun to emerge, and also the work of the iconoclastic Canadian media philosopher Marshall Mcluhan, when he wrote in the early 60s and said that what was emerging was a global village. Mcluhan had no inkling at that time of what the internet and the World Wide Web would do, but we are certainly seeing now the emergence, even though it's just in the last 3 years, literally, of a new kind of world information order. All of these things are fascinating. We're living in a very fascinating age. You will remember that there is an ancient Chinese curse that says, "May you live in interesting times," because that's very difficult to deal with, the changes that are being made in our lives. I want to take you back to 1871, when Walt Whitman, the American poet, wrote in a book called Democratic Vistas, he made this statement: "I say that democracy can never prove itself beyond cavil," cavil meaning attack, "until it founds and luxuriantly grows its own forms of art, poems, schools, theology, displacing all that exists or all that has been produced anywhere in the past under opposite influences. America has yet morally and artistically originated nothing. She seems singularly unaware that the models of persons, books, manners, etc., appropriate for former conditions and for European lands are but exiles and exotics here." This is one of the first articulate statements made to the effect that America, as the great democratic experience, needed to create its own forms of culture. In 1871, American culture still very largely consisted of a hybrid of European cultures. Of course, there were a significant number of them, and of course, including some aspects of Hispanic cultures in the South. But largely, American culture was this kind of European hybrid with some aspects of American frontier humor attached to it. Humor was, in fact, one of the few places where American culture was highly original. The great intellectual debate of the late 19th century in the United States concerned this American preoccupation with European culture, and perhaps more important, with the continued use of European critical standards to judge the quality of indigenous American culture. There's a great deal of truth in Whitman's lament for a truly American high culture and a popular culture had yet to emerge. American popular culture, as I said earlier, was to a large extent based upon frontier culture, and then American popular culture in the cities was to a large extent based upon European popular culture. It would be at least another 15 to 20 years towards the latter part of the 19th century that a true American popular culture would begin to emerge. But it's also interesting to note that people like Mark Twain paid particular attention to this issue. And if you remember Huckleberry Finn, a book that I assume everyone has read at one time or another, that the name of the famous wrecked riverboat in the river was, of course, the Sir Walter Scott, who was, by all accounts, the most popular writer in America at the time, but he, of course, was British. And there are several reasons for this, not only because Americans somehow had a feeling that European literature was superior, but also under the various copyright and trade agreements at that time, it was much cheaper to reproduce a European book in the United States, sometimes without licensing fees, these were illegal reproductions, than to pay indigenous American authors. So indigenous American authors were very hostile to people like Sir Walter Scott, who they also found in terms of the content of their books. And if you remember, in the middle of the late 19th century, Sir Walter Scott was writing about the medieval period, Ivanhoe, and books like that, his most popular book. And Mark Twain felt that Americans deserved better than, in essence, to be paying obeisance to what he considered to be a somewhat hack European writer. And therefore, the symbol of this wrecked riverboat, which is seen as the wreck of American culture, was named very aptly the Sir Walter Scott. I think that Twain took great delight in doing that. It was only, as I said, in the realm of folk culture that America had a rich tradition which emerged before the Civil War. And this is a significant point because for nearly 200 years in the New World, American folk culture, especially folk humor, was now quite independent of European culture. Whereas American high culture, that is the fine arts, was still very much beholden to Europe for its inspiration and aesthetic standards. This is because folk culture emerges directly from the practices of the people, whereas high culture tends to be largely created with certain aesthetic standards in mind. And as long as you had those aesthetic standards based upon centuries-old European standards, it hampered the emergence of indigenous American high culture. But folk culture, left to its own devices and shaped peculiarly by the frontier experience, which, if you remember, America was always a frontier pushing westwards, which I guess Steve was going to discuss in the next section. So you always had this frontier culture, and therefore people were always living on the edge, literally and figuratively. And out of that emerges this very rich humor and folk culture tradition. High culture by itself cannot satisfy the needs of the entire community for cultural expression, and this increases the importance of folk culture as a form of social and cultural coherence. So you have different levels of culture in a society. Essentially, sociologists and others who study it have traditionally divided it into 3 sections with variations on that. There's as many as 9 in some categories. But essentially you have high culture, you have middle culture, and you have low culture or folk culture. And it is out of the combination of those elements that our total culture is created. Now, if we examine the state of popular literature in America in the early 19th century, we find an uncharacteristic reluctance on the part of most American writers to break with the European tradition. There were, of course, major exceptions, people like James Fenimore Cooper and his famous novels, the Leather Stocking series, The Deer Slayer, and The Last of the Mohicans, and these were placed in very consciously American locales, but they were a minority. And even today, scholars argue about, quote, how American those books really are, because they come, again, out of a European tradition of adventure. Cooper himself, by the way, James Fenimore Cooper, was often called in the press the American Sir Walter Scott, which is an indication, again, he had to compete with Sir Walter Scott. There were several reasons for this American preoccupation with European popular literature. First of all, the public lacked the sophistication to try anything new. They were conditioned by this, and American writers were seen as inferior. Secondly, the writers themselves lacked a little self-confidence because all of their teaching and socialization had essentially been through the absorption of European aesthetic standards, and there was a sort of a parent-child relationship with the European culture. And lastly, of course, is the question that you find what I mentioned earlier about the trade regulations, that it was much easier and cheaper to reproduce European books in those cheap editions in the United States than it was to pay a royalty to an American writer for an original work. So, what I want to look at now is the emergence and the shift that occurs in our society as a result of the development of what we today call the mass media, and how this has fundamentally altered the entire structure of our society and raised many serious questions, which I know Dr. Mintz and I will be dealing with in the questioning period, but serious questions which pertain directly today to the continuing issue of what influence does the media have on our society. Between 1830 and 1890s, American society moved inexorably towards a true mass society. The population shift in the urban areas and the growth and importance of the city were vital features of American life in the second half of the 19th century. This process of urbanization, which, by the way, was not entirely due to immigrants. In fact, by any indication, immigrants accounted for less than half of the growth in urban areas during that last 50 years of the century. A significant part of that growth, and somehow gets ignored in the romance of telling of American history, was the internal migration of people moving from rural areas into urban areas in the United States. So that internal migration, not immigration, was a very vital but, again, often ignored factor, because we are caught up in the romance of the Immigrant and Ellis Island and all of those sorts of images. But nonetheless, this shift from the rural to the urban had a number of serious and long-ranging consequences, everything from social and cultural activities to declining birth rates to radical shifts in political power. All of this occurs as a result of this fundamental shift from the rural to the urban. Now, the German sociologist, philosopher Gabriel Tonnes, whose name I will attempt to write here, he wrote his famous treatise on this subject, which he called the Gemeinschaft, which is a form of rural society. And he sees the shift from the Gemeinschaft to the Gesellschaft, which he sees as a form of urban society. There is, I may add, no direct English translation of these two words. Sociologists have battled over that for many decades now. But essentially what Tonnes is talking about, which was a fundamental aspect of all societies, particularly Western societies in the 19th century, was this fundamental shift from the Gemeinschaft to the Gesellschaft. By the way, I always remember these two words in that the Gemein, and I use the word mine as an English translation to mean something that is close-knit, something that is personalized, and I use the word cells in Gesellschaft to consider something that is highly commercialized and impersonal. So that's one way of remembering those two words. But you will often come across these two words in any discussion of this very significant shift from the urban to the rural that begins in the 19th century. In fact, one can trace it back to the 18th century with the beginnings of industrialization, but the key move occurs during the 19th century. Now, so significant was this particular move that sociology as a discipline, which of course begins in Europe, and most American sociologists studied in German or secondly in British universities, but largely in German universities, that everywhere you went, this issue of the move from the Gemeinschaft to the Gesellschaft dominated sociological thought. And it triggered some important concepts, one of which is still with us today as a sociological concept, and that's called the loss of community. The notion that by moving from the friendly confines of the handshaking, contractual, knowing who you are, your place in society, Gemeinschaft, to the impersonal labor by contract, nobody knows your name, you don't do all of the work on the project, you are now atomized form of society known as the Gesellschaft. Now those were idealized types. And it's been noted by many sociologists, including Tonnes himself, that society contains both of these elements at any time, but it's the balance that's really significant. But the notion is that somewhere back in the Gemeinschaft, I like to refer to this as golden ageism, that we all drank mead around and danced around the maypole on Sundays. I assume you know what mead is. Mead is a wine that's made from honey, that's usually found in country areas. And the notion of dancing around the maypole, that we all got together and had a wonderful time and got on with each other, it ignores the reality that living in rural communities can be nasty, and as Thomas Hobbes said of society in general, short, nasty, and brutish. And then compares that with the nasty city where people go and nobody knows your name, in the words of the song from Cheers, and it's treated impersonally and bad things happen to you in the city. Dr. Mintz, and in his work in social history, I know knows far more intimately than I do the many works that were written in the 19th century that essentially suggest that by moving to the city that you will have evil things happen to you. It's a long tradition in American society which continues to this very day. It's particularly prevalent in a lot of religious writings of the 19th century that the city is where people go wrong. We've seen all those things. A young girl from a farm in Minnesota goes to Los Angeles, and the rest is history. So that kind of notion that the move from the Gemeinschaft to the Gesellschaft is very, very significant. Okay. What happens is, of course, that in the cities, that you now have these agglomeration of publics, various kinds of publics with various kinds of interests, particularly those who've moved from Europe, where in the early wave of immigration, they were much more sophisticated. Waves of immigration in the United States need to be differentiated in that not all immigrants to the United States were peasants. that tends to come at different times in history, largely toward the end of the century. The people who were bold enough to make the move to the United States in the early part of the 19th century tended to be relatively sophisticated and very well educated. As I say, it's only in the latter part of the century that we find this enormous waves of relatively uneducated people of peasant stock. But so you had this increasingly sophisticated urban population, and of course the people moving from the American countryside into the cities. They had to develop a whole new spectrum of entertainment or diversion for these individuals. Most of them were there to work, and work consisted in those days of essentially 6 days a week and about 9 to 10 hours average a day. So that leisure began to be taken extremely seriously, because you had to have leisure in order to essentially provide some surcease from the very tough working conditions that most of these people had. And as a result of this, it is the city where a whole new spectrum of entertainment is introduced. And these include the works of entrepreneurs such as the legendary P.T. Barnum and his various sideshows and ultimately circuses. There were entrepreneurs who were just eager to make a profit providing ingenious diversions for the city dwellers. In the period before 1850, the pattern for development of urban amusements had already been established, and you could find in any of the large eastern seaboard cities, and even a few of the ones beginning to emerge in the mid-plains, such things as the popular theater, variety, minstrel shows, the circus, special amusement parks, public dance halls, beer gardens, and even horse racing and other spectator sports were quite well attended before 1850. It's worth noting that at this early stage, almost immediately, literally the morning after the opening of some of these entertainments, there were critics. Critics who were concerned about the public's preoccupation with urban commercial amusements. Remembering, of course, we come from an age when amusement was highly suspect. I mean, not that this was a terribly grim society, but there were still religious strictures which suggested that if you were enjoying yourself, something was wrong. So there were continuous criticisms of the emergence of what was seen as people being diverted from their true purpose on this earth, which was to work. And so consequently, every one of these amusements, whether they be popular theater, public dance halls, beer gardens particularly, and sports, particularly if there was wagering attached to those sports, such as horse racing, were immediately condemned, a pattern that continues again to this day. Part of the difficulty in creating this cohesive urban community that was now establishing was caused by the changing ethnic and religious makeup of America in the 19th century. The Protestant ethic, upon which much of this country was founded, except for Maryland, which was a Catholic founding, glorified work and demeaned leisure and play. And this had come to the United States, or America as it was then called, with the Puritans, who thrived, and this particular philosophy of the so-called Puritan ethic thrived in the egalitarian society which developed in the United States, which suggested that hard work and essentially a pious form of life would lead to a much greater improvement in your life. The emphasis on hard work was seen by many as the only way to build a strong nation, and this guiding philosophy has been widely adopted even today as the basic credo by which Protestant America lived. However, it was becoming increasingly difficult to adhere to this ethic in the large, teeming cities, where its application was particularly repressive for working-class immigrants from countries that did not subscribe to the Protestant ideals and who needed recreational relief from their long hours. So you find this interesting clash between the existing Protestant ethic upon which much of the United States was founded with the different needs and ethics and religious outlook on the part of the immigrants. Let me give you one specific example. Catholics come from countries, generally, it's one of those kind of historical interactions where wine is an essential part of life. Let's pick on the Italian immigrant, for instance. Wine is served at every meal. This runs completely counter to the Protestant ethic of, in fact, prohibition of alcohol and intolerance to alcohol, and so you find this immediate clash. There are hundreds of letters of complaint written to newspapers in the 19th century in New York and Baltimore and Philadelphia about groups of Italians seen drinking openly in public at picnics in the parks on Sunday. And, of course, to the Italian immigrant, this was nothing. But to the Protestant, this was a very serious breach of American cultural ethics. And so eventually you end up, of course, in the 1919 with the last gasp on the part of the Protestant hegemony trying to continue its control of this country with the ill-advised imposition of the Volstead Act, the Prohibition Act, which brings about prohibition and all of the problems associated with prohibiting the sale and consumption of alcohol in 1919. That is seen by many historians as the last gasp attempt on the part of the Protestant group to control the ethics of this country. But this begins in the middle of the 19th century as these immigrant groups begin to practice their own form of culture, and the Church, the Catholic Church, has never had any strictures against the consumption of alcohol. Unlike many Protestant churches which do, the Catholic Church has never had that because it recognizes the need for its adherents to have some kind of relief from their hard-working conditions. So, what emerges then in this maelstrom of American culture in the 19th century, in the cities in particular, is a demand for increased access to popular amusements amongst both immigrants and the transplanted Americans. And what encouraged this, of course, is the gradual decline in the number of hours in the work week. The decline in the work week of most American workers meant more time for reading and for other forms of self-improvement. And this in turn leads to greater efficiency in productivity and more available leisure hours. It's a spiral. If you have people who are given some time to improve themselves, their working conditions, their ability to work, their ability to create becomes greater, and that in turn makes productivity higher, allowing then a decrease in the number of hours in the work week, which is an interesting fact that I'll discuss in a minute as it relates to, well, later, as it relates to today's work week conditions. Thus, in the non-agricultural industries, because in agriculture everything stays pretty much the same until the large combines begin to come in at the turn of the century, but in non-agricultural industries the work week declines by 10 hours between 1850 and 1900. In 1850 we find that the number of hours in the work week is 66. By 1900 that is declined to 56. So we have 10 hours with which now to play, which is actually a considerable amount of time. It's one whole day. The next 4 decades, reductions were even sharper than in the previous half century. Between 1900 at 56 and 1940, the work week declines about 5 hours for every 10 years. So we have a reduction of another 20 hours, and so we end up with 46 hours in 1940. So you can see there's a difference between, in that approximately 100-year period, of a difference of 20 hours a week for recreation and leisure. Now that does make a significant difference in the amount of leisure time available to Americans. And let me just make my point now, that what the peculiar thing that has happened in the last 2 decades as a result, ironically, of the introduction of the computer is that by all accounts the number of hours in the work week for white-collar workers has actually increased. This is a phenomenon that nobody, I mean nobody, predicted. I remember working for the Canadian government in the 1970s when we were preparing documents at that time to cope with what appeared to be the coming 4-day work week. The question was, where would people occupy all of their leisure time when they were only going to be working 4 days a week and had 3-day weekends? What nobody foresaw was the computer has expanded the work week for people now, because with computers more fancy things can be done. And you have, and I don't want this to sound like a Dickensian notion of the cruel employer here, but what employers now demand from their employees in white-collar jobs is their ability to manipulate computer information, which in turn creates a greater demand for computer information and translation of that information. The notion of Harry, I've bought you a laptop, so therefore you need to take your laptop home and do some work for me tonight. That phenomenon has now become well observed, and there has been no decline in the white-collar work week. In fact, there's an increase suggested somewhere between 5 and 8 hours a week of work for people now in essentially middle-level white-collar jobs, brought about by the fact that the computer can do more things. And of course, we all know that when you create something that can do more things, and people will use it to do more things. So we end up with this rather strange phenomenon that nobody predicted, that the work week has in fact increased. People may be doing it in different places now. They may be doing it at home on their desks at home, but the number of hours that they're putting in at the job has actually increased. So, but going back to the 19th century, the increase in available leisure time would encourage the creation and usage of all recreational forms, especially commercial amusements such as arcades, popular theater that I mentioned, and then the emergence of new specialized forms such as vaudeville and the movies in the 1890s. All of these required more definite and specific commitments of free time. You had to commit to going to the movies. It required you to, if not get dressed up, at least maybe wear your second set of clothes. Most people in those days, literally workers, only had 2 sets of clothes. And some of them didn't have that. But they had a best outfit and they had a working outfit. And you might want to put on your best outfit, but you'd have to catch the streetcar or walk a considerable distance to the movie theaters. By the way, most of the early movie theaters in that period of early 1900s were very closely situated near streetcar lines, because that's where people were able to get the transportation to take them to see the movies. But you had to commit time to doing that. Unlike a book where you can sit down and open it and read when you want to in your own home, commercial amusements require, at this stage, a commitment of time. Very clearly, if the time was available, people were doing this. People went out a lot. They did not have forms of in-home entertainment that we have today. The phonograph had barely appeared. They certainly didn't have radio until the mid-1920s, and certainly they didn't have television until the late 1940s, so that if you wanted to be entertained, you essentially had to go out of your house. And you know, wonder of wonders, people even paid money to hear people lecture. I always think that's amazing. Nobody would pay today. I mean, obviously they do, but the lecture, the lyceum, or the Chautauqua, the sort of a country fair where there would be speakers, famous speakers, people would pay money to sit in a room listening to somebody entertain them with a speech, a phenomenon that is very, very rare today. So out of all of this emerges these new forms of urban folk and popular culture, with songs about local personalities or events, banners, lectures, and even political meetings, all becoming a feature of the expressive cultural activities of modern life. Certainly, immigrants to the United States found themselves facing a bewildering array of recreational activity. And no sooner had they settled into their new environment than they were made aware that the pursuit of leisure was taken very seriously in the New World. Immigrants were also made aware of the importance of literacy as a means of achieving their ambitions. People who, in their previous village or shtetl existences, had found neither the opportunity nor the incentive to acquire these skills, now attended classes in settlement houses, church basements, and even formal schools, where they learned not only to speak English, but also how to read and write. And, you know, in many cases, those who were literate in their own mother tongues were taught how to read and write in their mother tongues, which they had not been able to do. So somebody speaking Yiddish had never written or read in Yiddish and would then learn to do that. And out of this comes a rather interesting phenomenon because of the nature of American society with its democracy and openness, freedom of speech as it then was. Many immigrants learned far more about their countries by living in the United States than they did all the time they'd lived back home, where they were restricted in terms of the amount of information. And this in turn created a great deal of political turmoil, so that you had agitation groups in the United States, for instance, for Hungary or for Russia or for Bosnia and so forth. People who suddenly in the United States were made aware of information that had been denied them in their own countries. So the United States in some ways became a kind of hotbed of nationalist activity, a phenomenon which continued all the way through until the Lithuanians and the other Baltic states were able to recapture their country, in essence, from the former Soviet Union just a few years ago. Those groups lived in the United States and Canada, where they had access to more information than they'd ever had in their homeland. So in the United States, the incentive to learn to read or write was great, because you had access to newspapers not only in English but also in your own tongue. The result of all of this, of course, is the emergence of a very vital, vibrant press. The establishment of the Immigrant press, as I mentioned, was indicative of the new freedom to be found in the United States, because people could now read in their own languages and read, as I said, things that they were not able to back in their own countries. But the Immigrant press, of course, the emergence of the national press was the real phenomenon. Between 1865 and 1920, the growth of both large-scale local and national media contributed to a significant historical shift in American society and its dominant forms of cultural expression. Now, what happens is that these new media that emerged between 1865, and I'm picking essentially the end of the Civil War as the sort of beginning period. One can go back to the beginning of the century to look at the emergence of the first penny press, the first popular press, which occurs in 1833. But it's as a result of the Civil War and the demand for information that the Civil War created that we have this enormous explosion of national media in the United States. For instance, the telegraph, which was developed in 1848, developed fairly rapidly, but it developed more in the 5 years of the Civil War than it had all in its previous history, simply as the demand for information and utilization of the telegraph as a result of the war increased. So we emerge in 1865 with this enormously important and growing infrastructure of various kinds of media. The new media were directly disseminated new kinds of popular culture in the form of information, that is news, and news is a form of popular culture, and entertainment. You now began to find magazines and newspapers providing more significant entertainment features. The notion of the newspaper as a kind of a daily magazine with cooking sections and women's section and men's section and sports is one that begins at this point after the Civil War. This direct dissemination of information on a large national scale leads to what has been called mass culture. That is a form of culture that is disseminated over the entire society. As we discussed earlier, the recreational demands of the urban areas and the social and physical conditions of the cities altered this traditional sense of community, the Gemeinschaft, and turned it into the Gesellschaft. Now, where this becomes significant in terms of the emergence of the media in the 19th century is that these two, or this development, the shift, are seen as an integral part of the mass media. In other words, contributing to this is the mass media. Now, surprisingly, during the 19th century, very few of the theorists who talked about the shift from the rural to the urban, readily identified mass media as a culprit in this. But in the 1920s and 30s, looking back upon the changes that have occurred, the association is made about the role that mass media have played in assisting this shift. And invariably, in describing this role, it's described in highly negative terms, which is today the legacy of that is the continued suspicion that the media do what I call leading us down the road to hell. The perception that the move from the Gemeinschaft to the Gesellschaft is in fact hell is widely considered, as I said, and somehow the media are seen as contributing to this progression. So, what happens is, though, when you have the development of national media, is that you have one important thing that is emerging is the continued existence of local culture as opposed to national culture. If we can just get a shot of that. Okay. What I have here is just a schematic drawing which indicates the kind of progression with the development of a new level of national cultural participation. So in the 1830s, you have, according to my little scheme here, one little block of national interest. this would largely have been such things as presidential elections, presidential politics, and things associated to a large extent with Washington. Whether we're in a state of war or not in a state of war. And by the way, in the 1830s, given the lack of the telegraph, it could take you as much as 3 or 4 weeks in the United States to find out that a month ago your country declared war on somebody. That's not, of course, true today. We have this very true little anecdote about the Great Battle of New Orleans, which was fought 10 days after the peace had been signed, because nobody could get a message to tell Andrew Jackson not to get into battle with the Redcoats in time. That kind of thing was quite normal. So you had national interest, which was extremely limited because of the informational transmission, the difficulty with transporting, literally transporting physically information. Somebody had to get on a horse. Somebody had to get onto a boat. Somebody had to get into a wagon. But you relied upon physical transportation of information in the period before the telegraph. Now, what you then have dominant is the number of local interests. In other words, these were things like local politics, local church, local school, even local games, the emergence of the first prototypes of things like baseball and so forth, all played on the local level. So in the 1830s, the image of American mass culture looked something like this. Small amount of national interest, very large amount of this small amount is associated, by the way, with trade. If you were involved in any kind of trade, you wanted to know the prices of things, what they were selling for in Europe and in Latin America and other places, because that's where you made your business. But most people concentrated on local interests. By the 1890s, as a result, 60 years later, of the introduction of national mass media, you now have a much larger block of national participation. And this would now include not only the politics and the trade and so forth, but ephemeral things and quite significant things such as baseball scores. You could now have, as a result of the telegraph, the baseball scores from the previous day, and you begin to find this curious phenomenon of people supporting teams that are not their local teams. So that if you lived in Baltimore, you could support the New York Giants. Did they exist in 1890, Steve? Do you remember? Right. So you get that phenomenon. I'm using that as an example. But you now have the emergence of a culture which is much more national, leading to a commensurate decline in local interests. People only have so much time. If you go to the 1920s now, of course, national interests begin to almost predominate. But it's important to note throughout this entire model that local interests are never totally subsumed. That even today, if I were to do a one for the 1990s, this national interest would be even larger, but the local interest continues. It doesn't totally disappear. People are still interested in the local schools and the local sports results and the local events on the calendar, whether they be plays or maypole dancing or whatever it may be. The fact is that local interests still continue, but you have overlaid on that now an increasing amount of national interest. We all followed the O.J. Simpson trial. We all want to follow on a daily basis what the President and Hillary are up to. We follow on a daily basis the ongoing saga of Tiger Woods winning the Masters and so forth. So all of that becomes part of national mass culture overlaid on top of local culture. Now, what happens, of course, is that in terms of going back to the Gemeinschaft and the Gesellschaft, is that this loss of community that I mentioned earlier, a key phrase in 19th century and 20th century sociology, suggests that as you move from the Gemeinschaft to the Gesellschaft, you lose your purpose and sense of who you are and your association with your true roots, that you move to the city and become rootless. And it has been suggested by many historians and sociologists that the mass media play an increasingly important role for people who have moved to the Gesellschaft precisely because they no longer have the roots that they had in their very friendly, supposedly friendly confines of their rural existences. Let me give you an interesting anecdote about this. When the famous Orson Welles' War of the Worlds episode took place in 1938, when the studies were done immediately after that, and Hadley Cantrell was the name of the man. Some of you may be interested in looking up his book. Professor Cantrell's book is called, I'm trying to remember the title now, but it is on War of the Worlds, okay? Oh, it's called Invasion from Mars, right. Invasion from Mars is the name of the book. And Professor Cantrell was the only sociologist who did immediate studies of the impact of that particular event. And some of you may know about the event. It was on Halloween night, 1938, where Orson Welles did a version on radio of the War of the Worlds, and people throughout the country were convinced that we were really under a Martian attack, and they panicked. So the panic broadcast is another title that's used for this. Anyway, what happened was, in Cantrell's studies, he found that there were pockets of people throughout the country that were more affected by other pockets. Particularly, he found that the closer you were to the actual events as depicted on radio in New Jersey, the more you were likely to panic. Now, that's understandable. But what he also found was that there were pockets of people in places like Southern California and in places in Arizona and so forth that were deeply affected, and it was hard to explain that. And eventually what they figured out was that the individuals who lived in Southern California at this time were very largely what were known as Okies, or other people who had left as a result of the Depression years, the Dust Bowl and other places, to move west seeking a better life for themselves. These people were rootless. These people were living in the Gesellschaft. They had moved from wherever, Oklahoma is where the term Okies come from. They were now living in farms or rural communities or trying to make a life for themselves in new places, and large pockets of these individuals were much more affected by the War of the Worlds broadcast than others. And the reason was they had no base of information upon which to judge the events. They had no people that they could call and say, "Uncle Jim, have you heard about the broadcast?" And Uncle Jim would say, "Oh, just, it's a Halloween joke." These people were rootless. And so we know that in cases of rootlessness, where people have lost touch with their basic background, they are much more susceptible to the mass media in the Gesellschaft. Now, this has been observed many, many times. If you move to a new city, you are much more likely to pay attention to the information in the media in that city as an attempt to orient yourself, to find out about the city. You're much more influenced by that kind of information than once you've established yourself and you know that the film critic in the local newspaper is a jerk, and not to pay any attention to what movies he's telling you to go and see. But it takes you a while to figure that out. So that people who have no roots or are in a case of shift will, of course, be much more susceptible to the influence of the media. Okay. It's interesting, too, of course, that it's no accident that during the time of this big shift that the media harkened back to some of the values in the Gemeinschaft. Just a little interesting anecdote, for instance. Some of the most popular songs in America in the early part of the 20th century, songs that are still played and sung today around campfires and so forth, are songs that deal with the loss of community and are harking back to the Gemeinschaft. Songs such as "In the Good Old Summertime," which was written in 1902, "In the Shade of the Old Apple Tree," which was written in 1905, "School Days." I don't know how many of you remember that song, but it was written in 1907. "Down by the Old Mill Stream" was written in 1910. All of these songs appeared in years when Americans were beginning to move away from the more restricting qualities of 19th century evangelical small-town culture. Yet at the same time, Americans were evincing this nostalgia for the simplicity, the security, and the warmth that the past represented, by contrast with the much more complicated urban and industrial existence. These songs, such as "In the Good Old Summertime," which is still sung very frequently, captured the social ideal just before the actuality and the sense of innocence associated with that period vanished forever. And many historians have pointed to the World War I experience as essentially being the end of this kind of innocence. The emergence of the end of ideology and so forth, which occurs at that point. In 1905, for instance, the sheet of "In the Shade of the sheet music," which was the most common way of disseminating music at this point, people actually played the piano. By the way, this is a little anecdote. More than half of all middle-class homes in the United States had pianos before 1925. Around about that time, with the introduction of radio, there is a very definite decline in the number of pianos and the existence of pianos in middle-class homes. I don't know what the percentage is today, but I would dare say it's probably less than 1 in 5. But at that time, almost every middle-class home had a piano because of the necessity to entertain yourself. But in 1905, the sheet music for In the Shade of the Old Apple Tree, with words by Harry Williams and music by Egbert von Elstein, sold over 2.5 million copies. Now, the composer claimed that he had been inspired by Central Park, but as there are no apple trees in Central Park, perhaps it was their very absence that von Alstein used as the nostalgia for his own hometown. And the words of the chorus of this song are interesting because if I just recite them now, I'm not going to sing them, although I could. They indicate a longing for the simpler rural community. And the chorus goes, "In the shade of the old apple tree, where the love in your eyes I could see, when the voice that I heard, like a song of a bird, seemed to whisper sweet music to me. I could hear the dull buzz of the bee in the blossoms as you said to me, with a heart that is true, I'll be waiting for you in the shade of the old apple tree." So you can see from a song like that, an extremely popular song, that there was a harking back to an existence which many of the people who bought that sheet music had never experienced. These were people who'd lived in cities all their lives, and even to this day, I'm amazed when I drive around a city, pleasantly amazed, at the names that housing developments are given. You know, Vista Ridge or Blossom Hill, where there are no blossoms and there are no vistas, but people have to do this in order to create this concept that you're going to live in a place where there's a village green with a maypole and you're going to drink mead. Okay, so this notion of this golden ageism, that somewhere back in the past we all had this wonderful, happy existence, is of course a part of the mythology of our society. I would advise any of you interested in this to read people like Sinclair Lewis, and particularly a book like Main Street, to get an idea of what life in those small towns was really like. But then I talked to enough students who grew up in small towns who confirm that small towns are not quite the nice places that people always make them out to be. So then what we arrive at, of course, is this question in the 20th century of the role of the media. And I don't really have time to cover everything today, but I simply point out to you that there are certain aspects of mass society that are worth taking a look at in much greater detail at perhaps some future time, Steve. For instance, the role of advertising. You know, we must never overlook the role of advertising and the importance of making America mass culture. For nowhere else has the art of deliberate persuasion been so skillfully practiced. Advertising, or the deliberate attempt to influence people to buy products or services, has a history as old as commerce itself. But it was the development as a result of these new sophisticated media forms, such as large city newspapers, magazines, and then ultimately, of course, the movies never became a major entertainment and never became a major advertising medium, but were translated later visually into television and radio. That with those media, advertising reached new heights in terms of its significance in shaping the form of American society through controlling its consumption practices. The development of the printing press in the late 15th century caused a revolution, as Dr. Mintz had mentioned earlier, but it also, not the least of which it did, was to make the availability of goods or services more widely known and accessible. The changing nature of manufacturing in the 19th century brought increasing uses of machinery and therefore increased the industrial output. The number of units of products were increased, and this in turn put pressure on advertising to sell the increasing number of products that were being made available as a result of industrialization and mechanization. So again, we get one of those spirals that increased sales increases the need to create increased consumption. Increased consumption creates more money to allow manufacturers to make more product, and the spiral goes upwards. And also, in a way, with the incoming influx of continued immigration, it helps to make the United States the most powerful nation on earth, because of this particular mix of consumption, production, and throw advertising into that mix has brought about an extremely powerful economy. The never-ending cycle of production and sales, characteristic of industrialized societies, created the essential role for advertising in the capitalist system. And what's interesting is that during even its heyday, the communists always had difficulty with the notion of advertising. And now, of course, in Russia, with the doors being thrown open, advertising has become a major issue. So advertising also, from a standardization point of view, creates the emergence of national brands. As I showed you that graph before, what part and parcel of this particular graph in the national interest is the emergence of nationally advertised brands of goods, which you did not find in the early period simply because there was no vehicle by which national advertising could take place. But once you have national advertising, you now have brands of goods that are capable of being sold in every state of the Union. And that was not true. And a significant factor in the manufacturing industry in the United States in the late 19th century is the emergence of these large national brands, which I guess most economists today will point out has nonetheless created a difficulty with antitrust regulation, where more and more big companies are swallowing up little companies, but we do find the emergence of brands. Again, let me just pose for you the issue in talking to Russian media scholars during the heyday of communism. One of the arguments they would always make about advertising and how disastrous advertising was is to point out, why did we need something like 42 different brands of toothpaste in the United States? Wasn't that a waste of money to advertise all of those products? Well, of course, that is the very nature of the free market system, and advertising has helped to bring that about. So just to conclude on advertising, the key question becomes for us today how much advertising is bringing about certain kinds of standardization of imagery. One example, does advertising create some kind of paradigm image of what the attractive woman should look like? Does this in fact create problems for other women who don't match up to that ideal? Is it responsible for bulimia and anorexia? Those are very serious questions. Are we so caught up in the imagery created by advertising that nothing that does not meet that ideal will suffice? If any of you have ever had the opportunity to go into a toy store with a child under the age of 10 and attempt to buy any product that is not advertised on television, you'll understand what I mean. If the products are identical, in fact may even be superior, the non-advertised brand, the child will want the brand that's advertised on television, because that is a validation of that particular product. The child has seen it on television. And we may laugh at children who do that. But I wonder about adults, all of us who buy certain kinds of cologne, certain kinds of clothes, certain kinds of automobiles, and God forbid, certain kinds of beer, because we are told that our lives will be superior as a result of consumption of that product. So, the other things that I really don't have time to consider right now, but I would like you to think about, is something like the emergence of photography. Photography emerges in the 1830s, but it isn't until 1884 that a method is found to reproduce photography in newspapers. So we had to wait a 50-year period before the technology allowed newspapers to become illustrative as well as just words. But the mass dissemination of photographic images that then proliferates after the 1880s in newspapers and magazines, picking up steam to a large extent after just before World War I. This has created a whole set of imagery as well, which in many ways is just as powerful as that of television. But we are constantly bombarded by these commercially produced images, all of which are intended to convince us to purchase certain kinds of products. I close then by suggesting that mass society, the creation of mass society, the move from the Gemeinschaft to the Gesellschaft, is a predominant feature of modern life. It is the result of many different forces, but primarily it is seen very often as the product of the mass media. The full relationship between the mass media and the emergence of the Gemeinschaft has yet to be fully understood. We don't really have a very clear picture, but we're beginning to reconstruct that picture as to what role the media have played in shaping our society. I'm very pleased to see that many younger scholars, for instance, are beginning to tackle such difficult subjects as radio. radio is one of those things that has been totally ignored in the United States. There's a lot of nostalgic research about old radio programs. You've all heard of those. But the question is, how much did radio serve as a social and cultural bonding mechanism in the United States? How much did those comedy shows, which don't seem terribly funny to today's audiences, nonetheless, how much did those shows play a significant role in keeping this country together during the Depression, when there were very serious threats that it would come apart? So there now is quite a phalanx of young scholars who are looking at such things as commercial popular radio in the so-called pre-music age, the pre-rock age, when you still had a lot of voice radio. People are now beginning to look at television. We've had television for over 40 years in this country now, and we are beginning to be able to make some sense of the impact of television. We've had movies for over 100 years now. Last year was the 100th anniversary of the first commercial motion pictures, and we are still battling with what role movies play in our society. We're still arguing about content of film. So 100 years after we introduced the medium, it is still highly controversial. And of course, to conclude, we have dramatic new information dissemination forms which have literally appeared in the last 5 years, namely the Internet and the World Wide Web. And every day when I open my newspaper, I find another story indicating some new direction available on the net. I particularly look forward to my Monday morning New York Times, which has a section in it, the C section, which is devoted to the information industries. And what I find fascinating about that is literally every Monday morning my world changes. There is a new development indicating some kind of extension of the use of the web, which is going to affect mine and your future. We just don't know where this giant possible thing is moving to, and as I discussed with Dr. Mintz earlier, the attempt to regulate it is simply outstripped by the technology. It's like trying to stop a giant ocean wave by building a cardboard wall. It's simply the technology simply overwhelms any attempt to try to create regulation. And of course, there are many people, perhaps the majority, who do not wish to see the web regulated in any shape or form at this point, because they do not wish to stifle this emergence of what the U.S. Judges in the appeals court, the second appeals court just below the Supreme Court, claimed was the greatest form of democratic communication that they had ever seen. So it's going to be an interesting new century as we come up, and hopefully this time historians will pay more attention to the role of the media and how they have shaped our modern society. Thank you, Stephen.
Well, let me ask you a few follow-up questions,
please,
if I might. The first one has to do with the statement that you were concluding with about the standardization of imagery.
Right.
That it has become possible since the late 19th century to develop standardized images of masculinity or femininity or sexuality that was not possible in the past. How would you assess this?
Well, you know, the issue of standardization is a funny one, because it's always one of those things that has been predicted as a danger. And yet, the continued proliferation of differences is there. And it's hard to explain that. Let me give you the best example. When radio was introduced, it was widely either praised or condemned that radio was going to totally obliterate regional speech differences in this country. It was suggested that radio was going to be so powerful that people would standardize their speech to the radio voice. Well, of course, that has not only not happened, regional speech patterns have become even more differentiated. It's really tough to understand some of those New Englanders, you know. So, in essence, it is hard to predict the standardization issue. There's no doubt that on one level, particularly on the consumption level, standardization does work. In other words, there is an image of what kind of clothing you should wear, what kind of car you should drive, and so forth. And some are much more successful than others. In other areas such as religion and those features where there are deep personal convictions, the media seem to be totally useless in changing people's ideas and attitudes. But I think in the long run, it has probably increased the ability to sort of standardize images because of large manufacturers who have to depend upon large markets. So you get anomalous things like 12-year-old boys in a supermarket in northern Minnesota dressed like kids from East Harlem. Because those are the images that they've picked up from the media. So it's not so much a question of standardization for me. I find the great humor actually in the notion of the spread of cultures without an understanding of what those cultures really mean. So we have a whole range of young white boys singing rap music, which began as a form of folk culture in black areas. And so that's what I think is perhaps more significant than the standardization issue, is the way in which cultures are now spread. We have this new phenomenon in music called world music, which is something that has emerged directly as a result of international satellite broadcasts, where people can now have amalgamations of North African Berber music with jazz and so forth.
It is just incredible.
Yes.
Another area that I'm very interested in has to do with the nature of the culture industry itself. That is, has been for a long period of time tremendous fear that the new mass media of the 20th century allowed different groups to disseminate their own views, to propagate their own views that were different from the kind of mainstream groups that dominated culture and morality in the 19th century. And can one speak of a fairly coherent ideology behind a culture industry, or is this much too diverse a group to make any generalizations?
Well, I think that this has been a complaint that the culture industry somehow, putting it in the conspiracy theory mode, that 10 key people in the country meet every Friday afternoon in some sort of bar in Los Angeles where they decide the fate of the United States in terms of what they're going to push. We just have a case now where one of our top TV stars, Ellen DeGeneres, has just declared herself to be a lesbian, and there's been some outcry about that, and it appears, I've seen a lot of complaint that this is the media industry once again foisting off on us some unfavorable lifestyle, etc., etc., as if this is done with a deliberate malice aforethought. I have never seen any evidence that there is a predominant ideology that is deliberately thought out. What is clear, though, is throughout history, with rare exception, mainstream media have tended to be very populist and have tended, therefore, to be largely liberal in orientation. This is not because the majority of journalists are poor and therefore are essentially liberal. It's because when you're dealing with populist sentiment and large numbers of people, the fact is a large number of people are poor, and a large number of people want to know that their interests are being taken care of. So there is a natural gravitation when you're dealing with large numbers of people, which is what advertising requires you to do, to pick not the lowest common denominator, but the least offensive denominator. And the least offensive denominator generally involves providing some kind of ideological perspective which is aimed at the general population and not at specific groups such as richer people and so forth. Now, I mean, that's a very simplistic explanation, but there is, as you know, a great deal of concern on the part of many people in this country that the media are liberal ideologues promoting a liberal ideology, and going back to the McCarthy era, a concern that the media were communistic, and they now, of course, the conspiracy theorists suggest that the media are promoting one world concepts. They associated with these mysterious black helicopters and so forth. All of this, as I say, there is no evidence that the media deliberately, in some kind of conspiratorial way, promote an ideology that is either one thing or another. When people do surveys of journalists, they love to point out the majority of journalists claim to vote for one party or the other, or that the majority of journalists were educated at certain schools. I always think it's more important to look at how much money they're making. If the journalists are making less money than the stockbrokers, then clearly the outlook is going to be different from that of the stockbrokers.
You're one of the most cosmopolitan and widely traveled people that I know. You've lived in Africa, you've lived in Canada, you've lived outside the United States a significant part of your
Yes.
life. And therefore you have a different perspective, I think, than many of us who spend our virtually entire lives inside the United States. One theme that we've dealt with in this class has been colonialism and issues of imperialism, and I wonder if you'd care to talk a bit about your perspectives on the issue of cultural imperialism.
Yes, well, when I lived in Canada for 20 years, a job that I had right after I graduated was with the Canadian government as the Director of Social Policy and Program Development with the Department of Communications. Probably the best job I ever had in terms of hands-on development of policy, and so forth, where you were working with real issues, not just textbook issues. And part of the real issues that my team worked with was to examine the impact of the Canadian CRTC, the Canadian Radio Television Commission, the equivalent of the FCC, had recently instituted a series of Canadian content regulations, which was directly aimed at the fact that majority of Canadians consume mostly American popular culture. And Canadians are strange that way. In person, they will essentially identify themselves very largely as not being American. That is the key feature of a Canadian culture, is to identify themselves as not being American. And they take great pride in that. But on the other hand, when it comes to consumption of television and radio and movies and so forth, they are clearly totally absorbed with American popular culture. They are in the colonial grip, in essence, of American popular culture. As former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau said, it was like going to bed with an elephant, you know, if you were a mouse, that is. So if you were the mouse and you turned over, the elephant didn't even feel it. But beware when the elephant rolls, okay? Now, I mention that because Canadians, being right on the border, are preoccupied with this question of cultural imperialism, and rightly so. Their own culture has to a very large extent been subsumed, and the government of Canada spends an inordinate amount of money relative to the United States, which spends almost zero, on trying to promote Canadian culture. I think the difference is in the United States, it's less than 29 cents per person to support the major cultural agencies. In Canada, it's something like $10 a head to support the major cultural agencies. It may even be higher than that now. But the reason for this disparity is the genuine concern that Canadians have for having their own culture being totally subsumed. Now, when I moved to the United States 20 years ago and began to talk about these issues, I found that my American students looked at me with enormous astonishment, and that is, number one, who would really worry about American popular culture? I mean, why are these countries upset about, you know, American movies and American television? You know, who cares about Starsky and Hutch and so forth? Then the second thing was that American students really would say, it's such a silly idea. I mean, you know, we're not trying to deliberately do this. I mean, we're not the bad guys. But whenever I gave them position papers to read, which thank God in many ways are not turned out by UNESCO anymore. UNESCO, government UN agency for education, was preoccupied with this issue throughout the 70s. I mean, they formed several major commissions which ended up in what was known as the free flow of information, which at one time threatened to license all journalists, for instance, because they were saying that the United States media coverage of the Third World was erroneous. It occupied itself with the 3 C's, you know, catastrophes, coups, and I forget what the other one was, but I mean, and crashes or something. But the fact is that this issue of cultural imperialism is a real one. And if you lived in some of those countries, the French particularly are concerned about it these days with the emergence of franglais, English French. It is a real issue to those countries. In the United States, it's hard to convince anybody that this is an issue. So there's a difference. The elephant is rolling over everybody, and only the people being rolled over are concerned. The elephant doesn't know that they're there. Now, I think what will happen, of course, is that new technologies have made possible 2 directly opposite things. They've made possible the production of more localized programming in television, but they've also made possible the introduction of programming from other countries. And so we have yet to see how that mix will work out. But modern technologies do allow a different kind of mix than the previous technologies did.
Media in this country are a business. And over time, despite the internet, it's become a more and more consolidated business. One example that I found extremely striking was when Scott Turow, the mystery writer, appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He also had a movie out made by another part of Time Warner, Warner Brothers. He had another book published by Simon & Schuster, which was published by Time Warner. In other words, there were connections that had never been possible before in which you could cross-market an author, if only William Shakespeare had had this.
That's right. Yes, I mean, that is remarkable. We could extend it further, maybe in the future, where a similar author might not only be published by, featured in, and have his movie made by, but he might be born in a hospital owned by the conglomeration that essentially is going to publish him. He could spend his entire life involved in this corporation. Yes, this is a very serious issue, and again, I'm just going to write this name down because it's a tough name, but the expert in this particular issue is Professor Ben Bagdikian, Bagdikian being a good Armenian name. Professor Bagdikian has written several editions of his book, which is called, I forget the title, it's Concentration in the Media, it's called Who Owns the Media, right? Okay, there we go. Ben Bagdikian, and his books, which is now I think in the 4th or 5th edition, is a book which I'd highly recommend for any of you interested in this issue of concentration in the media, because it spells exactly what Dr. Mintz has just said, and every time he does a new edition of this book it becomes more frightening because it essentially lays out these connections, and it's important that we know these connections. We know who owns what.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate the time.
Is that what the flashing light means? That our time is up?
That our time is coming to a close.
Okay.
Let's take a break.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, good. Okay. I've got a lot more I could have covered. I didn't think I'd run out of time, but I was.
I really found